Hello, Ian. We're together again.
Uh, Hello, Alex. That's very good. And we're approaching the end of part two of the book, the whole of the first volume, in fact, which is quite an achievement. There are, as you know, three appendices to part one and two at the end of this volume, and we probably won't go there, but it might be worth my mentioning what they are in case people are interested. The first one is really an in-depth examination of the evidence put forward by the main uh, proponents of the idea that the right hemisphere has nothing to do with creativity. So I thought it would be important to, since they take a different view from the one I do, to look at their evidence in some detail. So there's quite a long appendix in which I look at all their references and find out whether, in fact, they're right to say that there's no evidence here that the right hemisphere is of the greater importance, in fact, of great importance of any kind in the business of creativity. And surprise, surprise, what I find is that the evidence they rely on and the statements they make are not supported. So that's Appendix 1. Appendix 2 is really just a bit fun because I had talked about hoaxes in the sciences. And I also thought it would be worth pointing out that they don't just happen in the sciences, they happen in the arts. And some of them are rather remarkable and quite amusing in themselves. So I just talk about some of the best known literary hoaxes. And the third appendix is I think, quite topical in a way. It's become more topical since I wrote it because of the big debate about public science and how much we should believe the experts who tell us this and that and the other about what we should do for our health. And it's really, again, an examination of how sound these pronouncements are, and on areas that are pretty much mainstream ones like fat and salt and alcohol and water, and how much we should drink or not drink, and how much of these things we should take in our food, and whether there is good evidence or not. And spoiler alert, a lot of the time the evidence is not terribly impressive. So there we are. But as I say, we can't really go into those. But we will talk today, I think, about Chapter 19 and the coda to Part 2. So,
Exactly. So far, we're gonna cover today a 778 page journey. And it's good to know that there is also the appendices. So they are yet one more reason for your readers to engage with the book and for the listeners
yeah,
to go and read the book.
yes.
By the way, I sometimes check their comments and they're all really grateful to you and really generous and really loving. And one of the comments
Oh, that's
that
good.
I quoted here, which reflects what many people are saying, is that these are life affirming conversations and of course a life
Wonderful.
affirming book. So well, I thought
Yes,
it's a
yes.
beautiful way, maybe
That's how
generous
I
way
see it.
to put it.
Well, that's lovely. That's very nice to hear. Thank you for reporting these things. I must say I haven't looked at the comments much, but that's very good.
That's something everybody that has a huge follower group says one shouldn't do, but that's not our case. At least I don't have a big one, and that's not our case because there's no hate or anything. It's just loving comments
No,
of
no.
appreciation. So it's worthwhile
Well,
seeing
that's very.
how people are responding to what we're doing, especially to
No,
what you've written.
no.
Okay, so chapter 19 is entitled Intuition, Imagination, and the Unveiling of the World. And
Yes, yes.
it's a very interesting
And
stroll through, we'll go through it, through imagination, insight, intuition, beauty. It's a chapter I really enjoyed reading. And also it has many impressive and deep quotes, which perhaps we can read some of them.
oh, okay, yes,
Mm.
yes, good. Yes, the word unveiling is worth pausing on for a moment because I may have said before that I see imagination as not something that takes us away from reality, but actually is the only chance we have of feeling our way into reality. And I'm sure we will talk about that a lot more this morning. And I suppose I'm remembering something that the poet Shelley said about how the imagination removes the veil from the world, the veil of familiarity with which it's been covered, that we just think, oh yes, we know all this. But what the imagination enables us to do is to remove that veil for a while and to see the full amazing picture that is generally obscured by familiarity for us. Yeah.
I'm pausing because I don't know if to mention this now, because I think this is very important what you're saying about what's familiar. These commutes we make, I mean, I studied them long ago in rodents, the commutes they make from familiar territory into the unknown and how they go back and then they go back in and progressively expand and make the unknown rather known and more familiar. But there's this double tension between familiarity, and I think also Whitehead put it in a wonderful quote, like that we seek for novelty, but we're, what is it, terrified at the loss of the past. Well, that's not the exact quote, but there's this tension between the familiar and also our drive to go and explore and I was going to say conquer, but no, let's not say conquered. Let's say just getting contact with the unknown. Yes.
Yes, I mean, familiarity is one of those two-headed words. In one respect, familiarity, the root of it, of course, is the word in Latin familia, which didn't strictly mean family in the modern sense, but meant your household. So the familiar were the people who you knew best, not just knew about, but actually experienced and knew best. So in the sense of connaître and kennen. And so were very important to one. The familiar is something one can't live without and one loves. But on the other hand, as you so rightly say, these things have different aspects, and one aspect of familiarity is that sometimes we need to be able to remove it and to see things anew in a different way. And indeed, that's of course what intuition does, isn't it? Intuition is really a rearranging of the landscape for a while, or a new gestalt comes into being and you see it in a different way, slightly like those famous optical illusions in which you look at it and it looks like a young woman and suddenly it's the face of an old woman and so on.
Yes. Yeah, and to me the familiar also means the past, what we inherit, which we need to embrace but also transcend. So it's going beyond that and breaking from habits and habits of thought, which again, it's what we're going to talk about today, because as you propose, imagination, and you just said it a few seconds or minutes ago, it's a way, or maybe the way, to go back into the real, as opposed to what, again, they would want us to believe, which is the opposite, which is like going away from the real into fantasy. And you say, no, it's the very capacity, the very opportunity we have to be in contact with the world.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I quote there, and I can't remember the exact quote, but from Bergson, who is describing the difference between what he calls intuition and what he calls intellect. What he means by intellect is effectively the left hemisphere, when you come to see how he describes it. And intuition is effectively the right hemisphere. I mean, would be. I mean, I'm not suggesting that Bergson knew anything about hemispheres. That's not what I'm saying. But that he is describing those two ways of looking at the world. And he says that intuition is an intellectual sympathy whereby one enters into the thing rather than walking around it from the outside and measuring it and looking at it in that way. Yes. So that is... and he makes this point, doesn't he, that... in fact, it's one of the epigraphs of the chapter. I say something, I quote him as saying, it cannot be too often repeated that one can move from intuition to analysis, but not from an analysis to intuition. Yes. So in other words, one's right hemisphere grasp can accommodate at some stage the left hemisphere's contribution without destroying it. But you can't start from the left hemisphere's bits on the garage floor, as I sometimes put it, and try and understand it. So all of that, I think, is there in this idea of the imagination as something required for our feeling our way into the nature of reality and making contact with a living reality, sometimes for the first time. And I just wanted to say, while you refreshed my mind on it, this idea of the familiar and how we move from the familiar. We need a starting point in the familiar. I suppose what the problem would be if we only stayed with the familiar. But there's nothing wrong with the familiar. The familiar is our home. It's where we need to start from. But that we should always be seeing the familiar as evolving, as indeed everything is evolving. And it's like the question of tradition, and that's why I bring it up. I'm a great believer that the steps forward are made not by sundering oneself from a tradition and trying to make it all up oneself, as though thousands of years of the brightest of human minds were just to be jettisoned. But what one should be doing is always evolving. A tradition is never fixed and fossilized. It is always changing, moving, and developing. And it's in the safety of, or if you like, the vitality of the tradition, that a new change can be made that is a genuine organic change that follows out of the richness that had hitherto been only potential packed into the tradition. It is unfolded and becomes real. Whereas I think a lot of people think the idea is that you just jettison it all and somehow have a bright idea in the bath. I don't think this is good enough. And it's rather, I give the image of, if you want a climbing plant to go somewhere, you don't cut it off from its roots and put it somewhere else. You train it along a wall or along a hedge or over a tree or whatever it might be. So anyway, that's all by the by in a way. But let's start talking about the familiar, the unfamiliar, imagination and intuition.
Yeah. So you mentioned Bergson, which is, you quote right at the beginning. I think it's really appropriate, and also you, together with the idea of sympathy, which is a very powerful one. You also mentioned that Bergson himself says that this intuition is rather inexpressible, and we've discussed this in the past, and that's also. That also makes it hard for the more analytic way of thinking to buy into it, because it needs an explicit justification. So that's where we're always wrestling with. And also you mentioned that intuition generates insight. And there you say something that's echoed through this chapter, which is that this insight works in everyday life, as the examples we've seen in previous chapters, but also this is the same insight that we use to try to understand the fundamental nature of reality. So that immediately puts the intuitive layperson in the same business as the most refined philosopher. We need those insights.
Yes, we do. And you're quite right to emphasize, though it's a point that has cropped up a number of times, but really the language is at best a very imperfect tool, and at times a total impediment to our being aware of certain things, because language is not hospitable to them. They are nonetheless very important. And I would say that really all the most important things are very hard to put into language. It doesn't mean that one should never try to do so. I mean, I've spent decades trying to put these difficult ideas into language. So I do see that, but it is a slightly paradoxical enterprise. And I'm reminded of the fact that when I started writing my first book in my 20s called Against Criticism, which was really about the problems of literary criticism. One of them was, I quoted from Alice Through the Looking Glass, that, she asked, well, where is it? It's over there. And she says, well, in that case, I'll walk that way. And the Red Queen says, that seems to be a very stupid idea. If I were you, I'd start by walking in the opposite direction. And she doesn't believe the Red Queen and finds that she can't get there by going the direct route. And it's only when she appears to be turning her back on it that she achieves it. So all my life, I've been aware of the difficulties of language and yet devoted myself to using it.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Anyway.
and also, well, if you bring to mind Alice in Wonderland, there's so many images there that are useful. Also, the idea of 6 impossible things before breakfast, isn't it? Which is in a way what we're trying to achieve. Yes. Yes.
Yes, we are. Yeah. Yes. Although we've stretched it out over a few months rather than compressed it into before breakfast. But I must say that when we go into the third part, we're really in the territory where it's going to be like that, because we're going to be talking about time, consciousness, matter, and all those things. So that will be interesting.
So let's go back to insight. Two more qualities of insight that I find them worthwhile remarking is, as you write, that it is surprising and it is not non-obvious. And again, that can sound obvious, but I think it's not. So, here we have, as we just spoke about, intuition has to do with sympathy, is inexpressible. It is, when it generates insight, it is surprising. It's not obvious. And then this leads to imagination, which, quoting Einstein and many others, you propose the idea that, as Einstein himself said, it is a real factor in scientific research. And I think the word real here is key, right? Because see the need to emphasize that the imagination is real. And it reminds me also of Tim Ingold's recent book, Imagining for Real, where I think he's trying to do something along the lines of what you're doing to heal that concept and say, well, imagination is about the real. It's not against the real or away from the real.
No, that's right. And Ingold is an anthropologist, isn't he? So he's looking at, I think I quote him on the topic of animism. And I suppose there too, I've been inclined to say, well, before we dismiss it, this is another way of looking at the world from the one we're more familiar with, in which nothing, including the living, is any longer considered anything more than a mechanism. So it may be an insightful way. Indeed, I believe it is a healthy way to approach the world, to see the possibility at any rate.
Yes. And this leads us to beauty, and you mentioned aesthetics. And, well, so I have a good friend who's an author, and I was talking to him the other night, and we were discussing materialism, reductionism, and all these isms. And he said something that puzzled me. I think it's powerful. He said, well, we can put arguments for or against it, but there's something that's very important to me, he said, which is the aesthetics of it. And that if everything is a kind of tale or a myth or a narration, that particular one is quite ugly. And that's something you also touch in this chapter when you speak about mathematics and beauty. And also the line from Dostoevsky comes to mind, right? Like beauty will save the world. So the importance of beauty and the aesthetics in imagination and intuition. It's like a rope.
Very important.
It's a rope that saves us.
Yes, I think it is. Yes, I don't think I say very much at all, if anything, about ugliness, but I do talk about beauty because it comes up so many times in the works, particularly of mathematicians and physicists. And interestingly, although you don't find it much now in biology, Darwin's work is absolutely full of beauty. The word beauty or beautiful occurs on average on every other page, half the pages, 1 in 2 of the pages of the Origin of Species.
Wow.
So this is extraordinary. And I think I quote the figures somewhere in the book. But anyway, that's beside the point, because mathematicians So many of them say, I was guided to this conclusion by its beauty. And there are a couple of examples, one from Hermann Weyl and another one from Schrödinger. Schrödinger's equation seemed to him so beautiful that he felt he ought to adopt it, even though the evidence at the time was against it. But 10 years later, when electron spin was discovered, the scientific evidence changed to align itself with Schrödinger's finding. So Schrödinger's being guided by beauty was correct. And so many examples are given there. Just about every mathematician and scientist who's made a discovery by an intuition talks about its beauty. Yeah. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, not everything that looks beautiful is true. Yeah. Not only in life, but even in mathematics and cosmology, because yes. I quote Kepler's sudden intuition in Graz one day that the orbits of the planets were related to the structures of the Platonic solids. Unfortunately, they aren't.
Yes.
So one has to be wary of it. But you see, there's something very odd. One has to be wary of everything. One has to be wary of where a purely crass logical line will lead. One has to be wary of some kinds of science and be skeptical about it. In fact, that's what science is. It's largely skeptical until it feels it can't do other than accept a certain position.
Yes.
But all of these things are things about which we should exercise a degree of skepticism. But for some reason, that seems to be lost in relation to science and reason, but it's the one thing people put about intuition, how it can lead you astray. Well, it can also lead you to some very, very important conclusions. And I think if we'd paid more attention to our intuitions, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in now.
Yes, it's not about beauty only. It's maybe more about seeing the world in a new way, which is a theme that percolates throughout this chapter. And also the leap. Yes. I'm fascinated by this idea of the leap that it entails, right? That the mind takes a leap, and once it has taken it, it can see that new landscape.
Yes.
Maybe it's the same landscape, but it can see it anew, and it cannot really say how it is that it is seeing it this way at that particular moment.
No, but one of the things that I would say to agree with your earlier suggestion is that I think that when one does see into the depths of these things, what one constantly sees, and Einstein repeated this all his life, is the beauty and the complexity of things, not the randomness and the ugliness of things, and the meaninglessness of things. So the journey that I take in this book and hope that readers will accompany me on is one in which effectively I am unveiling an image of the world which I believe is not only truer but far more beautiful than the one that we currently hold. Yes. So I'm with your friend that you quote, saying, well, another thing about it is there are many stories and myths, and they're beautiful, but this is an ugly one.
Yes, and one only needs to turn on TV, which I don't do, to realize the turmoil in the world right now. But let me just bring in another element, which is joy. And Bergson would write about joy as maybe an indication that intuition is taking place, that we can see the world in this way. So maybe these are hints. These are hints maybe that we are onto that path, which your whole book is delineating, right? All these many paths to truth. So joy is another another of those we don't hear. We don't hear in the news, on Twitter, or anywhere else. Beauty and joy. Where are you?
I know, and I don't know. Have you seen the interview that's just gone up that I did with David Fuller?
Yes, I have. Yes.
I really because
like
in that
wisdom. Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Well, one of the things I was saying is, joy seems to have, spontaneous joy, what we call joie de vivre, seems to have gone out of life. Yes. And even for young people for whom it's so important and so lovely. Yes. Anyway, there we are. We're in danger of covering a very, very big canvas. We must try to restrict ourselves here.
All right. I took notes, so we won't get lost, because I took notes so that we can more or less, see all the elements. So maybe one that follows, so that we don't get lost, is you talk about these insights during, and the importance of sleeping, but not just as resting, but as dreaming, and also whether or how insights come during sleep or when we wake up. And that's just not just, as I understand it, a physiological statement, but also has to do, in my view, with consciousness and different states of consciousness, and how mind can be liquid, solid, or in gas form. And in those transitions, maybe we can harvest those insights. That's a very metaphorical way of putting it. I'm not saying you say it this way.
Yeah. No. But yes, I mean, I do refer to the literature that suggests that dreams are one of the ways in which insights come to people, and that's well known. And my way of thinking about what happens in that sleep is that we know that the frontal cortex is relatively subdued, and that the occipital cortex, which deals with visual imagery, is extremely active. And that one of the things that we do in dreams is to try things out, is to experiment, as it were, the normal filters that shape the everyday, the dependable, the normal for us are removed in sleep. And so we can go different places, and we see connections in sleep that we wouldn't normally see. And the fact that one is going to try out these possibilities, these possible ways of being in or engaging with the world, brings with it a certain danger, because our body is very active. Dreaming engages the body enormously. And of course, if you started to play out your dreams, it would be very dangerous. And so nature has thought of that, and this explains for me the extraordinary thing that I've thought about ever since medical school. Why is it that when one is dreaming, one's body is paralyzed? It can make small movements, but it's paralyzed. And I think that is, and this is not just true of humans, it's true of all animals that we know dream. And interestingly, the animals that do dream are mammals and birds, principally. These are the great dreamers. And as I say, these are also the great problem solvers. So they may well be using dreams to both bring to light things that they need to take note of and to help solve problems.
Yes. And then coming back to wake state, and somehow be closer to a solution that you were meditating on before. Yes.
Yes, and I give examples of. Yes, it's popular wisdom is borne out by laboratory tests. That, when you allow people to have a go at a difficult problem and then allow them sleep, they'll do very much better at solving it than the group that didn't. So yes, it's a very real phenomenon, and we saw it actually in the case of Franck Mourier, the racing tipster, who discovered that he had to have this brief sleep before he went onto the course. Yeah.
Yes, an ode to Spanish siesta for us.
Yes. Oh, what a civilized way of life you have.
Yes. Okay, Iain, you spent many paragraphs on poetry, and I know you're a great. I mean, you've been reading poetry, haven't you, in your channel, and posting the videos?
Oh yes.
And
yes.
Yeah, and you quote what poets say about poetry, and that also brings us to something that's again very beautiful and very important, which is this idea that the artist, and you use this word which I think it's key, midwives, the artist midwives, that thing that's coming into being. So can you expand on that, because there's a lot to say about what is going on and how important it is. Also back to your conversation with David, right? That in this need to act, how are we going to act? Not in control mode, maybe in midwife mode.
Yes, exactly. And so the conscious mind plays a small role somewhere, but it's likely to be more interruptive than anything. And the key is to try and keep it out of the creative process, because it will always be narrowing down the scope to something definite, whereas the mind is seeking after something that is as yet only half formed. It's trying to, as I say, midwife something into existence that is already half there. Yeah. You know, it needs to get it down the birth canal. And I quote poets on this process, and they emphasize various things that, you know, that one can only know it a little, that one must still the mind that wants to make it clearer too quickly, and that also at the very moment that we start to think about it in linguistic terms, we are beginning to kill the intuition and the insight, so that there is a race, as it were, to capture it. And this is where, in a famous phrase of Shelley's, the mind in creation is like a fading coal. So that already, when you see that it's creating, the coal is already fading, the fire is disappearing as you are trying to find it. You might well say, well, that's just a romantic insight and so on. But as in The Master and His Emissary, I showed there are so many parallels between what we call romanticism and what was wisdom in other parts of the world since time immemorial. I quote an almost exact expression of this from the 17th century Japanese poet Basho, that, you know, you must be alert to it, and when the thing comes, you must take it, and not hesitate and think about it. But you must do it as almost like a swordsman who is a very skilled player makes the stroke without thinking about it, and thereby wins the contest. So it's that business of having the confidence, allowing the thing to come into being, and it's like an approach of an angel, really. The idea of an angel is an interesting one. I don't think I talk about it in the book at all, actually. But I mean, it comes from a Greek root meaning messenger, angelos. And so a messenger from some other place that is not where our mind is now. And the thing about a messenger is that they have there's a certain drive to what they're doing, that they're delivering something that is important, and that you can't guess the message and dismiss the messenger. You need to allow the message to be delivered. And that is the image that Fra Angelico painted, to my knowledge, at least 4 times in his life, and they're all remarkable paintings of the Annunciation, in which an angel came to the Virgin Mary and told her that she was to bear a child, and so on. And this thing is so important for understanding the human imagination and intellect, that I think Fra Angelico gets very profound meaning from this image, which he was repeatedly attracted to.
Oh, thanks for mentioning that about the angel, and also what you were saying before. It reminds me to this way of saying it in Spanish, which is estar al acecho. Al acecho. So you must be ready for it, but it's not like you're provoking it. It's a particular mode of attention. You're ready for when it comes, and when it comes, you need to be ready. And and that sets up a particular mode of encounter. And what you were saying sounds to me like an elevated mode of encounter, which is again a theme that runs through your book. This encounter we have with the world, where it's not just ourselves or the world. It's this communion, we could even say, and you quote some of these artists, or maybe I'm quoting you when you say there's this fluid boundary between the I and the it. So if So if we could make up some language, maybe we could create something that's I eat, like something that merges them, but we can't, or we don't do it, and so we still need to be explaining it. But I think it's a very powerful idea.
And somewhere I quote the 18th century scientist and philosopher Lichtenberg, who said, rather than say ich denke, I think, we should say es denkt, it thinks.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's the I and whatever it is are
Yes.
not separated, but are
Yeah.
part of a process. And that
Yes.
process I am in, and that process it is in. And I use the expression, which is perhaps not a very skillful one, but I couldn't think of a better one, of the field of me. That things happen in the field of me. The reason I like that is I see everywhere that we are better thinking about the constituents of the world, both phenomenological world and any other kind of world that we are trying to assess in terms of fields. And one way of thinking about each of us is that we are a field that for a while is here and has coherence, and one can say where it is, and one sees the things that happen in that field that make that field what it is. It interacts with other fields. But in any case, there is no complete boundary between us and our thoughts, our perceptions, and the imagination, and between us and the world. I'm not saying that I am the world and the world is me, but I'm saying there is a fluidity at the boundary between these things, and that we co-create.
Yes.
This is something I emphasized in the very introduction to the book, and we'll probably talk about again in part 3. But the world comes into being out of this encounter between us and something. And you say this thing is very important, this idea that you have to be ready for it. So in other words, your senses have to be on the stretch. I'm not very good on my Bible, but I seem to remember that Christ says somewhere that the importance of people being, he will come again, but when he comes, it's important that people are ready for him and receive him. And I think whatever one makes of that, and who am I to make anything out of it particularly, but it's true of our way of encountering the beautiful, the complex and the real in our imagination, is this being alert, but not active, being sort of, if you like, actively passive, actively attentive, actively alert. And in that fertile space, things will happen. And you just have to trust that they will. But they won't happen if you try and force them to. They will come of their own, but you need to be playing a part in that midwifing of them into being. It's very, very important that. And yes, I quote poets on this, but I also quote the wonderful philosopher who was so hard-headed, Friedrich Waismann, who was a pupil of Wittgenstein's and a professor of logic. And he gives one of the best descriptions, which I quote at some length there, of this process of something coming into being. It's not that I make it come into being, he says, but it's also not that it happens entirely without me, but it's something that happens within me that I am part of, and it brings something about into being. And he talks about the necessity of not having too much clarity at that stage about what it is. And there's a rather wonderful quote in which he said, I always think of clarity as the refuge of minds that have no thoughts of their own, or something like that, or nothing important to say. And I have to be careful because I'm a great believer in clarity. I try to practice it in my writing, but I also think that there's an enormous amount to be said for the lack of clarity. What is Weismann's phrase? He said something to be said for that fog, or something like that.
Well, we could.
I won't be able.
Yes. Let's see.
Where does he say that? Yeah.
Yeah, and while we look for it, invoking humor, you could say, "Let me make this very clear," and then you quote this on clarity, and having nothing really to say.
Okay. Well, there we are. Anyway, it's interesting. Yeah.
Well,
and then I of course, sorry, go on.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and then I quote this this apparently entirely true story about the common room at Merton, where J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor, and how tired all the other fellows got of the fellows' guests coming into common room and meeting the great man and fawning on him. And one of them said, in a fit of ecstasy. Oh, Professor Tolkien, I so admire your work. They're so full of imagination. And this grumpy mastodon was heard from behind a newspaper going, imagination, made it all up. And,
Yes.
and I mean, I think I may have said that before, but a reason of quoting it is, of course, that in essence, it's both true and untrue. Making things up is a rather special thing to be able to do, but that imagination is never really just making things up. That is a kind of fantasy, whereas imagination is being able to, as I say, see something, see a life in things that before one had never seen. There's an anecdote in De Quincey's Tales of the Lakes and the Lake Poets about Wordsworth being out on, I think I quote it in The Master and His Emissary, about him being out on the road, and Wordsworth and Coleridge were quite used to walking 30 miles in a day. I mean, thought nothing of it, and going to meet the mail coach coming from Keswick. And in order to detect whether it was coming, he lay down on the ground and put his ear to the track, because he could hear the sort of rumblings of the mail coach coming, even if it were miles away. And while his senses were on the stretch, he looked up and suddenly he saw a star, and he finds it very difficult to express quite what that star meant to him at that moment, but it was really almost a life-changing event. It was an intimation of something where he suddenly saw this star as very important for the first time. He saw stars every day, but this star suddenly was something special. And there are other examples from both Wordsworth and Coleridge, but from other writers, about this business of when your attention is very rapt by trying to receive something that you know could be there, that at that moment the veil, as it were, is dropped and you start to see things anew.
Yes. Let me go back to co-creation again, because there's one temptation, at least in a light sense, where one may think to co-create is that, well, you and I, let's do something together, or what happens is done together. But again, the we deceives, because co-creation, I think you've been insisting, it's a reciprocal sculpting. So I'm co-creating, and that thing is also affecting me back. So it's not that two subjects are doing something together onto something else, but it's in this encounter with the world.
Exactly.
Yes.
No, that's a brilliant point, and thank you for making it. That's exactly right. It's not two or more people engaged in creating another thing. It's that they and the world are becoming what they are through this encounter, through this reverberative encounter. Yeah. And maybe it would be worth talking about Coleridge's distinction between primary imagination and secondary imagination, because it makes this connection clear between what everybody normally thinks of as, everyone would accept that, say, Wordsworth or Coleridge were imaginative in their writings. But the point that they were making was that this imagination that is used by poets and artists and composers and all that is a special case of a primary imagination that we use all the time. And so what poets do is, in their terms, secondary imagination, building on, in a special context, the imagination of the cosmos that is bringing things into being. And in case that sounds very airy-fairy, I quote, I think at the head of this chapter, from both Richard Feynman and from William Blake, don't I? And I can find it. Here it is. So Feynman says, Feynman the physicist, the imagination of nature is far, far greater than the imagination of man. That's interesting, that the force of nature is a kind of imagination. And William Blake said, to the eyes of the man of imagination, nature is imagination itself. Now, there you have, from an 18th century mystical poet and a 20th century fairly hard-headed physicist, a perception of what they both call nature as an imaginative force. And this is exactly what Wordsworth and Coleridge are getting at when they talk about this primary imagination. Coleridge was slightly tiresome in his terminology, and I remember when studying him being slightly irritated by his use of the phrase the esemplastic power. And you thought, you have to make up words like this. But to be fair, it's a translation of a German word in Einbildung, which was coined, I think, by Schelling. And Coleridge was enormously indebted to Schelling to the extent of simply translating passages of Schelling and adopting them as his own. But as you know, I have an enormous respect for Schelling. I think he's probably the best example of an underrated philosopher, an extremely great philosopher who is largely now ignored or neglected. But in any case, the point that they're making is something like this. Secondary music is that music that you hear when you go to a concert and hear a string quartet. That's fine. But it's really just a special case of primary music, which is what you hear when you hear the wind in the trees, you hear the rain pattering on the window pane. This is primary music. And so if you look at that from a point of view, instead of music of imagination, what you experience, if you can only part that veil that Shelley talks of, when you walk out, as I would hear, to hear the stream, to hear the sea, to hear the wind, to hear the animals, this is all being brought forth in primary imagination between some faculty in me, which we would call my imagination, and the imagination of nature. And that is at the heart of their philosophy, that the world is a living thing that is responsive, that comes into being alongside us, that makes us what we are, and we make it what it is too. I think this is lovely, and I will come back to it probably repeatedly in part 3, because I want to emphasize that we play a part in the cosmos. Instead of the story that we're sold, that actually we're irrelevant and it doesn't matter what we do because it all comes to nothing in the end, as though death made life pointless. Actually, death makes life what it is. But it's not a denial of life, it's the end, the fulfillment, the conclusion of life. But in our process of engaging with, encountering the world, which is what we call being alive, we are helping to shape what is. So we have a very responsible role here. What we imagine, whether our imagination is good, pure, beautiful, we create that in the world. When our imagination is destructive, ugly, negative, and ungenerous, then we're actually destroying something, or for the time being, failing to help bring into being something that's really, really important. So I think that's pretty important stuff. Yeah.
And maybe you can add something on this, because that brings to mind something I've been wrestling with for some time, which is this kind of psychological or psychosocial dynamics whereby there's this constant attempt to decenter the human. And I understand where it's coming from. We've created a big mess, right? But as well, somebody else, because so many people are saying this today, but maybe more people should say it aloud. Well, it's not by taking ourselves out of the equation of the planet that this thing is solved, but then how to do it without falling back into what brought us here in the first place. So there's something tricky about the human. I mean, we insist, and there are all these books coming out now that insist that all the other animals can do amazing things. Sure, that maybe we're not so special, but every species or every animal is unique. Sure, but there's something, I would say, fishy there, which seems to say human, like it's a human being saying, please humans, get out of the way. And that doesn't seem right to me, but I cannot express it yet what's fallacious about that healthy attempt. It's like searching for some sort of innocence, but doing it through guilt. And that's not going to work.
Well, to me, it seems a clear expression of another aspect of left hemisphere thinking, which is always that to do with conflict, and that in order to make something valid, you have to denigrate something else. So, for example, I mean, we see this all the time now, that the perception that women have not played a big enough role in many aspects of life is a valid one, but it would be so much better to focus on an appreciation of what is wonderful about women and wonderful about men. To achieve this through denigrating the male is to damage ourselves, to damage our potential as a society, to damage the family. And so I would love a world in which men honored women for being women and women honored men for being men, you know, and that's to say that shouldn't be odd. That should be perfectly understandable. And so we often enter into debates in which, in order to exalt some aspect of life, we denigrate everything else. And I don't need to dot the I's and cross the T's. People will see this all around us in our culture. And so I think I'm enormously sympathetic with the view that we have had an unhealthy dominion over animals, not uniformly. I mean, our history also contains much about love and care for animals, but as a general point, we have tended to underestimate them, what they know, what they can do. And for me, one of the things about researching the brain for 30 years is that I've also looked, obviously, at animal models and what animals can do. And it's been one revelation after another about what animals and plants can do and so on. So I think that is very important. But there is something very special about what humans can do, and we should not lose sight of that. Because if we do, we will sink to the level we believe ourselves to be at, which is a very low one. No, we should see ourselves as we truly are, which is capable of achieving something more than animals, as far as we can tell, can achieve, which is to respond to the sense of purpose, to respond to the sense of beauty, to respond to the sense of complexity, to see it and to help further it in the world. I mean, in part 3, we will be looking at things like purpose and values. And one of the things I think that creation, the evolution of beings has reached the point that it has with humanity is not because we are particularly good examples of surviving for a long time. Human beings live for a puny 70 years on average, whereas there are actinobacteria at the bottom of the ocean that single examples sometimes live for 500,000 to 1 million years. So they've done far better at surviving than we have. No, the business is not just about survival. It's about complexity. And we have traded a degree of survival for being far, far more complex than an actinobacterium and better able to respond to. I'm not saying that animals don't see and perhaps delight in. I very much doubt that would be right to say they don't see and don't delight in and don't acknowledge and respond to certain aspects that I'm talking about of the natural world and of nature in general. But I think that humans have a special role in that. And when you compare, an animal that builds its nest or a bird that builds its nest and the beauty that it brings and so on, that is lovely. But you cannot compare it to, Mozart's chamber music or Schubert's songs. And these are something so wonderful. And they come out of the cosmos. It's another point. We have this very strange idea that the cosmos is sort of hostile to us, and that we somehow, despite everything, manage to exist in this in this pointless, meaningless cosmos and strive to do good things for the little while we're here. But the good stuff that we produce and that we create comes out of the cosmos. You cannot get away from the fact that this meaningless, pointless, random cosmos is capable of, sooner or later, bringing forth Bach's St. Matthew Passion. It doesn't come from outside of that. So, so there's got to be something very special about that universe and about us. And another mistake people make is to look at the scale of the universe and look at the size of a human being and say, well, how can we matter? But this, again, is a typical left hemisphere way of thinking, that measure everything on one scale. But, there are many things in spiritual literature that, that one person's goodness or life can be as valuable as, there isn't a mean accounting calculus. We just don't know how big and how important the soul, the imagination, the life of a person is. We don't know. And one interesting scientific observation is that the universe would have to be enormously large for there even to be planets at all. And it would have to be about the size that it is to even be able to bring forth a planet that could support life. So even if we turned out to be the only examples of life in the universe, and I think that sounds a bit unlikely to me, but even if we did, it would have taken the 13.8 billion years of evolving this universe for us to get to be at all. These are things that are not enough thought about, talked about, although, the science is there for people who are interested. Anyway.
Yeah, huge topics and so many mantras to deactivate, because they really seem to be there to preclude us from grasping what's going on, which is all we want to do in a way, to figure out what is going on. It's confusing.
Yes.
Well, let me go back
to that,
to
do that, we do need imagination, you see. I mean, science needs imagination. I separate imagination out in this chapter, and I say, really, science, reason, and intuition are sort of skills and faculties and so on. But imagination is something else. It's on another level altogether. It grounds all three of them. And none of them can do anything without the engagement of the imagination. So that's, it's not on a par with them. It is actually what underwrites the value that they bring.
Yes. Which goes back to midwifing and also this definition that Coleridge has on imagination, which I wrote down here. As he said, the laboratory in which thought elaborates essence into existence. I mean, to talk about what essence and existence is would take us many, many sessions, but it sounds like something is being born and there's this alchemical process going on there. And also the idea of the laboratory could be split. And I also like to think of a lab, which is nothing like the labs we inhabit today, which is a place where people ora et labora, lab oratorio. But so if we rescue the meaning of those words, what an image, what an image, this laboratory in which thought elaborates essence into existence. It's worth stopping there.
And of course, Coleridge was very interested in science, and all these people were, they didn't make these huge divisions. Schelling himself was enormously interested in and knowledgeable and wrote about science, as well as about the imagination. So yes, and I love that. I mean, we can't today, but we will, I think, in future talk a bit about the difference between essence, different meanings of the word essence, but one here is potential. So a general potential is made to come forth as an actual embodied instance. And that is the process of creativity in the world that we know, both the creativity that is the whole world around us, but also the creativity of great poets and artists of various kinds. Should we talk a little very briefly about the distinction that should be made between fancy and imagination? Because Coleridge is very important in making this distinction. And he also, in his description of it, coming back to this, which I last read in my 20s, I was astonished to find that he was describing the right and left hemispheres. And fancy is what the left hemisphere does, and imagination is what the right hemisphere does. And he says, the organic interpenetration of parts and the formative union of shaping and being shaped. I'm quoting there Coleridge's editors, James Engel and Walter Jackson Bate. But here is Coleridge suggesting not just a power that unifies, but one that specifically synthesizes opposites. So he says, this power reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities, of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order. And in each of those cases, you can see that he's pairing the things that the two hemispheres do. The left hemisphere tends to sameness, the right hemisphere towards difference, the left hemisphere towards the general, the right hemisphere to the embodied, the left hemisphere towards the idea of something, the right hemisphere to its image, the left hemisphere to the representation, the right hemisphere to the individual case, and so on. I mean, could go through it all, and I do. But what he's showing is not only those two differences, but that imagination brings them together, whereas he sees fancy, which is his term for fantasy, as simply a dress that is donned by something so that it for a moment looks different. It's like fancy dress. We dress something up and it looks different, but imagination recreates something from its very core outwards. It doesn't just put on a cloak that makes it look amusing or different for a while. Yeah.
Oh, that's very evocative, because we're talking about unveiling as some sort of cloth that we're trying to, but that also brings to mind different ways. One where you just have something covering it to pretend, and another one where actually one is sewing reality together, which is what we were saying some minutes ago about co-creation.
Well, that's right. And I should point out that the unveiling metaphor, which I still think is a good one, comes from Shelley, who was a very young man and hadn't had decades to think about philosophy in the way that Coleridge had. But again, you know, I usually find that Coleridge is very, you know, very astute, amazingly insightful in the way that his lectures are marvelous reading in their own right. But all this comes from Biographia Literaria, which was his intellectual autobiography.
Well, here I have two doubts. Maybe you can help me clarify. One is when bringing forth unveiling, of course, we need not take it too literal, just enough. But a veil seems brings forth this image of there's something underneath. It is there, and there's something covering it, and then there's this act of just revealing it, unveiling it, but that doesn't bring this notion of, well, the thing was already there waiting for me to unveil it, right? There's no co-creation there, but perhaps that's just the limitation of the image that it evokes.
I think no one image or metaphor can completely cover it. I mean, another one that's good that I quote right at the end is from Erwin Chargaff again, talking about how the great biologists work in the very light of darkness, he said. That there's too much thinking you know stops you from really seeing what's there. And he said we've been deprived of this fertile light, and he was talking about how now everything has been dragged into the self-conscious, verbalized, analytic way of thinking. And that when he talked to other scientists, they didn't understand what he meant by this illuminated darkness that was needed. And he said, if you take he gave this sort of image that if you think you want to know what's there, and you take a flashlight, a torch, and shine it around where you are, you'll just see a lumber room. But if you allow your eyes to adapt to the dark, you'll suddenly see up above something far, far more extensive and more meaningful and important than the lumber room, but that your light drives it away so that you no longer see it. I think that's a very beautiful thing. And he didn't mean obscurity by darkness. He meant, again, one of the many, many opposites. And the very first chapter of part 3, which we'll come to next time we talk, is on the coincidence of opposites.
Yes.
You know, darkness and light have this relationship. You know, famously, Hegel said that the owl of Minerva, the owl of wisdom, takes flight only at twilight. So,
yeah, beautiful. I need to meditate more on that. Now it's related. My other, when people say it's more a question than a comment, or maybe it's more a comment than a question,
yes.
is with the word imagination and the idea of an image, especially because we've been using these other more tactile metaphors or ways of expressing the contact with the world. Again, contact is about touch. And then you also write about intimations of the matters that are glimpsed, but only partially seen. And it puts us in touch. So, but again, image seems to convey something that's visual, not literally, but there's something that has to do with touching. And also, if I come back to unveiling, well, I can pull the cloth, but I could also touch it, as I do when I play with my daughters when they're under a blanket. And so maybe you can help me see this interplay between one sense, vision, and the other one, touch. And it seems we're talking more about touch than vision. Nevertheless, we're using imagination.
Yes. I think one ought to make a distinction between two kinds of image. And if we ever get into that level of detail, it's a distinction which Meister Eckhart makes when he needs to talk about our ability to see something, and yet our need not to be limited to what our eyes literally can take in. It's also interesting that I refer to psychological experimental evidence that we actually imagine things visually better when our eyes are closed. So in other words, when we're not actually looking at an image in that sense, but we're allowing the faculty that engages with the world visually to engage for a while with something that is in our, as we say, imagination. So there is a distinction between something that works purely as a symbol, so it has a significance that can be translated fully into language, and a picture that evokes something in us. Again, this idea of intimates something, so that a great painting is inexhaustible. You can look at it all your life and you will never get to the bottom of what it has to tell you. But an image like a stop sign beside the road has one meaning, and it is utterly explicit and translatable into language. So there is a distinction between, as it were, the idea of something that acts as a symbol in a way that a road sign does, and acts as a symbol in a sense that is deeply reverberative, imaginative, like the symbols that Jung was talking about, as the way in which our soul operates in the world by disuse. And another distinction I could make would be between the eye falling on a surface and staying there, and the eye going through the canvas, as it were, and seeing what is, I mean, obviously not literally behind the canvas, but going through, using a work of art as almost like a gateway or a doorway or a limen that enables one to move through to another world. And I always come back to Goethe's brilliant perception about this, that we see that this helps when understanding the coincidence of opposites, that we don't see the individual by turning away from the general, by looking through it. We don't see eternity by turning our back on time, but by going through time. We don't see the realm of the imagination by turning our backs on the sensually apparent world, but by going deeply into and through the sensually apparent world. So all our senses. Interestingly, I just had a conversation with somebody who wrote to me, making, I thought, a very good point, and I felt I had to say something about it. That, you know, mystics often talk about a world that goes beyond the senses. So perhaps the senses are, in some sense, an impediment to that world. But I think what I want to do is to avoid setting up an antagonism between, which has often been there, particularly in Christianity, between the world of the body and what it offers to us through the senses, and the spiritual world. That yes, in a sense, one may have to renounce parts of the one to achieve the other, but they shouldn't be thought of in this very simple-minded way as being opposites. But for many people, the body is the portal to things that go beyond the body.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that again. And so we reached to the coda, to part 2, right?
Yes,
Would we wrap
that's
it
it.
up?
What
Yes.
what can we say?
Well, there's something in that coda, which is, by the way, 2 pages. Right. So again, an
Yes.
invitation. So you quote Donne, which I hadn't read, and which evokes this image of, well, and you're right, Donne believed that truth could not be approached in a linear fashion by direct assault,
Yes.
but only by
Yes.
climbing one's way up a
Yes.
rugged path with circles as it approaches its goal.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you and I have been recently to Paris, and it brought to me the town of Paris, and the fact that when we
Yeah.
go and have our conversations, we need to climb up, and actually it's not in circles, it's in a spiral way to get to the palazzo where we
As
host
always.
those. And so
Yeah.
on the one
Yeah.
hand, there is this possibility of getting into the things themselves, when we were quoting also Bergson as like to get into the things, not go around them, but we're poor humans who still need to kind of make that lovely journey going upwards and spiraling inwards. And so I thought that, which is the last paragraph of the coda, and made a very beautiful rounding and invitation for part 3 of the book.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. And I suppose what I'm thinking of in brief is that the lines that I've pursued through neurology, through philosophy, and increasingly in part 3 through physics are different ways of walking around. And I have in each of them as well walked around. We had to walk around in neurology. We have to walk around in philosophy to see the different aspect of what we're looking at. And that therefore it can't be a single linear track, but something much more three-dimensional that comes, as it were, into focus and becomes more and more real and tangible for us as these different paths illuminate more of their goal. But I also make the point, just for people to bear in their minds, that in part 1, I was really addressing the question, if there are 2 versions of the world offered to us by our brains, which one should we take more seriously in our path to truth? And everyone knows that the answer to that is the right hemisphere. And that then in the second part of the book, I'd said that we need each of these paths, science, reason, and intuition, but we need them maximally where the right hemisphere rather than the left hemisphere does the important work, and that the whole thing is guided by imagination. You can see imagination as almost like the guide that helps us on this trip. We could see this as almost like Dante's Virgil, who accompanies Dante on his journey through hell, through purgatory to paradise. That's not an exact example of the 3 stages of this book, but imagination is always the thing that will guide us to a better appreciation of what we're looking at. Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
Okay, so do you want to say, we've been talking for quite some time today. You want to say a few things about
Yeah.
what's awaiting us in the third part, or we can just leave it here
Yes.
and because we'll talk a lot about it, obviously, but maybe as a teaser.
Yes, we will. So perhaps it would be just worth mentioning to viewers and listeners where we're going to go, to boldly go, in our next in our next sessions, the last sessions where we go through part 3, where we'll be trying to, how we'll do it, I don't know, but to talk about such big topics as the coincidence of opposites, the relationship between the one and the many, the nature of time, the nature of flow and movement, the nature of matter and consciousness, the nature of values, of purpose, and the sense of the sacred. None of which I think can be easily accounted for as simply derived from one or other of the things that I've just mentioned, but deserve a treatment in their own right. So they're all colossal topics, and they're treated at some length in the book, which is why part 3 is the length of part 1 and 2 together. So I don't know quite how we will do it, but I think it will be exciting, and I hope that people will accompany us on that.
Well, I can only say that, like Sancho Panza, I'll be there with you.
Are you saying that I'm just tilting at windmills? No, I'm sure there is a better analogy for our journey, but there we are.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you again, Iain. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
It's been very good. Thank you too very much.
All right. Until soon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye bye.